When the imperial physicians performed their final, clandestine examination, they found a creature of impossible contradictions. Draped across silks woven with gold thread lay a body that belonged not to a 12-year-old emperor, but to a famine victim, a ghost haunting its own opulent tomb. The skin, translucent and cold, was stretched taut over a delicate bird cage of ribs, each one a stark ridge against the flickering candlelight. His eyes, once celebrated in court poetry for their vibrant intensity, were now cavernous, sunken pools of shadow in a face that had become a porcelain mask of suffering. The official chronicles would later speak of a sudden, tragic wasting sickness, a mysterious blight that had stolen the empire's divine child from its loving embrace. But the truth, whispered in the darkest corners of the palace and recorded only in the most secret of journals, was infinitely more sinister. This was not a death by disease. This was a death by design, a slow, methodical, and exquisitely cruel murder orchestrated not by foreign enemies or armed assassins, but by the very men who had sworn to protect him. They had not used poison, nor the blade, nor the garrote. They had used something far more patient, more insidious, and in its own way, more terrifying. They had used hunger. This is the story of how the most powerful boy in the world was systematically and deliberately starved to death, not in a dungeon, but in the heart of his own glittering palace, a final grotesque testament to the fact that power, when it wishes to be truly cruel, can transform even a gilded cage into an instrument of unimaginable torture. Before the shadows consumed him, he was the empire's son, the cherished and only son of a warrior emperor whose name was a thunderclap across 3 continents. His father was a man forged in the crucible of battle, a leader whose authority was absolute, rooted in decades of conquest and an unwavering belief in his own destiny. The boy emperor was to be the inheritor of this monumental legacy, a child raised not as a son, but as a successor, his every waking moment a lesson in the burdens of divinity. From his earliest years, he was surrounded by the machinery of power, legions of guards, armies of servants, and a court of nobles who bowed to him as they would to a god. His world was a kaleidoscope of marble halls, triumphal parades, and whispered adulations. Yet this world, so vast and magnificent, was also a meticulously crafted prison. He was taught to read the stars, but not the faces of other children. He learned the histories of conquered kings, but never the simple joy of an unguarded conversation. He was the most precious object in the empire, and like any priceless artifact, he was kept behind glass, polished for display, but never truly touched, never truly known. The suddenness of his father's death was a cataclysm that shook the empire to its foundations. A fever, swift and merciless, accomplished what no enemy army ever could. In the space of a single week, the pillar of the world was gone, leaving behind a power vacuum and a 12-year-old boy. The Senate, in a display of performative loyalty and genuine panic, immediately proclaimed the child as the new Augustus, the new living god. The coronation was a spectacle of breathtaking grandeur, an empire desperately trying to convince itself that nothing had changed. The boy, draped in robes so heavy he could barely stand, sat upon the marble throne, a bewildered child, staring out at a sea of adult faces, their expressions, a mixture of fealty-pity and something else, something colder and more calculating. He was the master of the world, but he was also an orphan, alone and adrift in a shark-infested sea. He did not know it then, but the moment the imperial diadem was placed upon his head, his fate was sealed. The men who knelt before him were not his subjects. They were his successors, and they had already begun to plot the quiet, methodical dismantling of their king. The Regency Council that formed around the young emperor was a collection of the most powerful and ambitious men in the empire, a veritable nest of vipers, cloaked in the robes of statesmanship. They were the architects of his father's victories, the seasoned administrators who kept the gears of the vast imperial machine turning. To the public, they were the boy's loyal guardians, his wise mentors, his devoted protectors. In reality, they were his executioners, albeit of a patient and subtle sort. Their leader was a man of immense political cunning, a patrician whose family had served the state for generations, and who viewed the world as a grand chessboard upon which people were merely pieces to be moved. He saw in the boy emperor not a sacred trust, but a profound and dangerous instability. A child ruler was unpredictable, susceptible to influence from the wrong quarters, a potential rallying point for rival factions. For the good of the empire, he reasoned, and for the consolidation of his own power, the boy needed to be managed, controlled, and ultimately neutralized. The council's methods were born of a cold, political pragmatism that bordered on the sociopathic. A violent coup, a quick assassination, would be messy. It would create a martyr, inspire rebellion, and tarnish their carefully crafted reputations as loyal servants of the state. No, their solution had to be elegant, deniable, and above all, slow. It had to look like nature, like tragedy, like the will of the gods. They would not kill the emperor. They would simply allow him to fade away. They would construct a narrative of a frail, sickly child, cursed by the gods with a delicate constitution, a boy emperor too pure and fragile for the brutalities of this world. And the most effective way to make that narrative a reality was to orchestrate it themselves. The first step was to complete the boy's isolation. His world, already a gilded cage, was now sealed shut. His personal guards were replaced with men whose loyalty was to the council alone. The few tutors and servants who had shown genuine affection for the boy were quietly reassigned to distant provinces or dismissed under fabricated pretenses. They were replaced by a new retinue, a hand-picked cast of characters who understood their role perfectly: to be the smiling, deferential jailers of a condemned child. Every letter he wrote was intercepted. Every word he spoke was reported. His life became a piece of theater, and a council were the directors, producers, and sole audience. The boy was the star, but he had no script, no understanding of the plot, and no inkling of the horrifying final act they had written for him. This was the genius of their cruelty. It was a crime committed in plain sight, masked by the performance of duty and the language of care. They were not murdering their emperor. They were merely protecting him, guiding him, and tragically, warning his inevitable, divinely ordained decline. The public displays of the boy emperor's life became more magnificent even as his reality grew more constrained. He was the centerpiece of every grand ceremony, the silent, divine justification of the council rule. During triumphal processions, he would be seated in a golden chariot, draped in purple and ivory. A small hand raised the priceless wave of the adoring crowds. The people saw the symbol of continuity, a living embodiment of the empire's enduring glory. They did not see the fear in his eyes, nor the subtle tremors in his hand. They did not see the circle of stern-faced men who surrounded him. Their gaze is not on the crowd, but fixed on him, their presence in constant silent weight. The council understood the power of propaganda better than they before. The commissioned statues of him robust and healthy living, his childish features subtly masculinized, his expression serene and confident. Coins were minted bearing his idealized portrait, circulating to the furthest corners of the empire, carrying gold and silver. Edicts were issued in his name, written in the soaring, authoritative language of his father, announcing new conquests, proclaiming festivals, and bestowing honors. The emperor was soon to be governed. His divine wisdom flowed out from the palace and guided his people. In reality, the boy had no knowledge of these decrees. He was a ghost haunting his own government. His name a rubber stamp, wielded by the man who had pride for his name. His education, once a source of pride for his father, was now transformed into another tool in his destruction. His new tutors, men chosen for their unthinking loyalty to the council, began to starve his mind. The challenging lessons in rhetoric, philosophy, and military strategy were replaced with mind-numbing recitations of his own divine lineage. He was taught not to think, but to believe. He was taught not to question, but to accept. His role, they impressed upon him daily, was not to rule, but to be. He was a vessel for the empire's spirit, and a vessel must be empty to be filled. The most insidious part of this psychological campaign was the perversion of affection. The council members would praise him lavishly, calling him our divine lord and light of the world. They would commend his docility as wisdom, his silence as thoughtful gravitas. They rewarded his passivity, his lack of curiosity, his growing lethargy. They were conditioning him to accept his own diminishment, teaching him to find comfort in his own fading presence. It was a masterpiece of psychological abuse, a slow and deliberate campaign to convince a child that his only value lay in his own disappearance. The starvation of his soul preceded the starvation of his body, preparing the ground for the final physical result. It was a necessary prelude, ensuring that when his body began to cry out for protest, his mind would have already been silenced, his will already broken. The physical starvation began with a lie wrapped in the language of medicine. One day, the chief imperial physician, a man whose career and fortune were now entirely dependent on the council's favor, declared that the divine emperor's constitution was showing signs of delicacy. His humors were imbalanced, his internal fire burning too brightly for such a young frame. For his health, for his longevity, for the good of the empire that depended upon his well-being, his diet must be carefully managed. It was presented not as a deprivation, but as a great and necessary act of care. The feasts that had once graced the imperial table, with their roasted peacocks, honeyed cakes, and exotic fruits, were replaced by a new regimen. At first, the changes were subtle, almost imperceptible. The portions became slightly smaller, the rich sauces were omitted, the sweet wines were replaced with watered-down concoctions. To any outside observer, it was merely a sensible adjustment for a growing boy. To the boy himself, it was a source of constant, gnawing dissatisfaction. He was always a little hungry, never quite sated. But he was a child, and when he complained, his concerns were met with gentle, patronizing smiles. The divine body must be purified, the physician would say, his voice smooth as oil. Excess clouds the spirit. His tutors would nod in solemn agreement, and his guards would stand impassively, their silence a wall he could not breach. He was being conditioned to distrust his own senses, to believe that the pangs of hunger were not a sign of need, but a symptom of his own internal imperfection. This was the core of the gaslighting campaign that would define his final years. His reality was systematically denied and replaced with a fiction crafted by his abusers. When he grew listless and weak from the lack of nourishment, the physician would examine him with a grave expression and declare that the wasting sickness was taking hold, just as he had feared. The prescribed treatment, of course, was an even more restrictive diet to calm the agitated body. The boy was trapped in a perfect circular logic of abuse. The symptoms caused by their cruelty were used as justification for even greater cruelty. His weakness proved he was sick, and his sickness required the very cure that was killing him. He would sometimes awaken in the night, his stomach a hollow, aching void, and hear the distant sounds of feasting and revelry from the council's dining halls. The faint aroma of roasted meats and baking bread would drift through the cold marble corridors, a form of exquisite torture for a child who had been fed only thin gruel and boiled vegetables. He was the emperor of the world, and yet he was starving while his servants feasted. The sheer, maddening injustice of it must have been a constant torment, eroding his sense of reality, making him question his own sanity. Was he truly the emperor? Or was he a prisoner in some elaborate, incomprehensible play? The psychological toll was immense. He became withdrawn, prone to fits of desperate, impotent rage that were immediately labeled as further symptoms of his illness. He would weep with frustration, and his tears were recorded in medical journals as signs of melancholy and humoral imbalance. They were pathologizing his every natural reaction to their abuse. His suffering was not evidence of their crime. It was evidence of his own inherent brokenness. In the space of a few months, he was transformed from a vibrant, if sheltered, child into a pale, lethargic ghost. He no longer had the energy for his lessons, which the council noted with feigned sadness. He spent most of his days in his chambers, often lying on his bed, too weak to move, his mind a fog of hunger and confusion. The golden cage had become a sick room, and his jailers had become his nurses. Their gentle, caring hands the very instruments of his slow, agonizing demise. They were perfecting the art of murder by 1,000 kindnesses, a death so gentle, so deniable, that history itself could be convinced it was an act of love. As the boy's physical world shrank to the confines of his bedchamber, the council's propaganda machine went into overdrive to maintain the fiction of a vital, governing emperor. The illusion of his health was as critical to their power as his actual decline. They became masters of theatrical statecraft, creating a phantom ruler to placate the populace and intimidate their rivals. For important public appearances, where the emperor's presence was non-negotiable, a chillingly effective solution was found. The council located a distant cousin of the emperor, a boy of similar age and build, who was brought to the palace in absolute secrecy. This child, bewildered and terrified, was schooled in the art of imitation. He was taught to mimic the emperor's posture, his mannerisms, and the particular way he held his head. Dressed in the imperial regalia, seen from a distance atop a balcony or in a fast-moving chariot, the deception was perfect. The crowds cheered for a healthy, vibrant ruler, never knowing their true emperor was wasting away, a prisoner in his own home. This use of a body double was a masterstroke of political cynicism, transforming the very concept of the imperial presence into a marketable fiction. The emperor was no longer a person. He was a role that could be cast. The real boy's only remaining function was to die, thereby legitimizing the power of the men who were killing him. The stream of imperial edicts continued unabated, their production becoming a well-oiled bureaucratic process. The council would convene to decide policy, and their decisions would be drafted by scribes who had perfected the art of forging the imperial signature. They announced the founding of new cities, the reformation of tax laws, and the appointments of generals and governors. To the vast majority of the empire's citizens and officials, the government was functioning seamlessly. The boy emperor was proving to be a wise and decisive ruler, guided by his loyal council. This fabrication was reinforced by a controlled leak of private information. Courtiers in the council's pay would spread stories of the emperor's diligent study, his profound insights in matters of state, and his deep piety. They painted a picture of a young prodigy, a boy whose physical frailty was more than compensated for by his immense intellectual and spiritual strength. It was a narrative that was both inspiring and tragic, preparing the public for the eventual news of his death while simultaneously cementing the council's reputation as the loyal facilitators of his genius. Their control over information was absolute. Any official or servant who expressed doubt or asked too many questions was swiftly and silently removed. The palace became a place of whispers and fearful glances, an environment where complicity was the only path to survival. To challenge the official narrative was to challenge the council itself, an act of political suicide. And so the lie grew, layer upon layer, until it became an unassailable truth. The empire was ruled by a ghost, a fiction, a carefully constructed illusion. And the real boy at the heart of it all was becoming more ethereal with each passing day. He was a secret that the entire court was forced to keep. His slow, agonizing death, the foundational lie upon which the new regime was built. The cruelty of this deception was not just political. It was profoundly personal. It was the ultimate act of erasure, a denial of his very existence, while his image was being exploited for political gain. He was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, his name on every tongue and his true self visible to no one. The prison of the boy emperor's life, once metaphorical, became brutally literal. As his weakness intensified, the council, under the guise of protecting his fragile health, confined him entirely to his imperial apartments. The sprawling palace, with its gardens, libraries, and courtyards, might as well have been on the other side of the world. His universe shrank to a handful of rooms, each one a testament to the grotesque irony of his situation. The walls were hung with tapestries depicting glorious battles and bountiful harvests. The floors were covered in thick carpets from the farthest reaches of the empire. The furniture was inlaid with ivory and precious metals. He was surrounded by a breathtaking display of wealth and power, a constant mocking reminder of everything he possessed and nothing he could enjoy. His confinement was enforced with a gentle but unbreakable firmness. Guards, their faces impassive masks, were stationed at every door. They were instructed not to speak to him, only to bow and fulfill the orders of the physicians. If he tried to walk to the window to gaze out at the city, a servant would rush to his side, murmuring about the dangers of draughts to his delicate lungs. If he expressed a desire to read from the library, a tutor would appear with a single pre-approved text on the virtues of piety and rest. Every impulse, every flicker of independent will, was immediately and gently smothered. The sensory torture, which had begun with the distant smells of feasting, was now refined into a daily ritual of cruelty. His meals, which had shrunk to near starvation portions, were served on solid gold plates, delivered by servants who were forbidden to meet his gaze. He would be presented with a few boiled roots and a cup of thin broth, a meal fit for a condemned ascetic, yet served with all the pomp and ceremony due a god. The contrast was a calculated psychological assault designed to break his spirit and reinforce his powerlessness. He was the master of all, yet he could not command a simple loaf of bread. The sounds of the living world became another instrument of his torment. He could hear the laughter of stable boys in the courtyard below, the martial music of the changing of the guard, the distant rumble of the city. These were the sounds of a world he was no longer part of, a life that was moving on without him. The silence of his own apartments, broken only by the whisper of servants' feet and the ticking of a water clock, became a deafening roar, amplifying the sound of his own shallow breathing and the frantic hollow beating of his own heart. His pleas for more food, once met with patronizing explanations, were now met with silence or, worse, with pity. The physician would sigh sadly, shake his head, and make a note in his journal about the delirium and food obsessions that were characteristic of the final stages of his illness. They had successfully reframed his body's desperate, primal scream for survival as a symptom of madness. He began to doubt his own mind. Was the hunger real, or was it a phantom created by his sickness? He was a child, alone, with no one in the world to validate his experience. The entire machinery of the state, from the guards at his door to the most powerful men in the empire, was aligned in a conspiracy to deny his reality. It was a perfect, inescapable trap. The cruelty had reached a new level of sophistication. It was no longer just about causing physical suffering. It was about annihilating his sense of self, about making him an accomplice in his own destruction, by convincing him that his suffering was his own fault. They were not just starving his body. They were consuming his soul, leaving behind an empty shell, a hollowed-out symbol ready to be filled with whatever meaning they chose upon his death. In the depths of his despair, a single desperate spark of defiance flickered to life. The boy emperor, now a skeletal figure lost in the vastness of his imperial bed, decided to make one last, futile stand. He had noticed a new guard, a young soldier from a distant province, whose face still held a trace of human sympathy, a flicker of unease at the grim theater he was forced to witness. For days, the boy conserved what little energy he had, his mind sharpened by starvation, focusing on a single desperate plan. Using a piece of charcoal he had managed to hide from a brazier, he scrawled a few frantic words onto a scrap of linen torn from his own bedding. "I am hungry. They are killing me. Help me." It was a child's plea, a message in a bottle thrown into a vast and merciless ocean. The next time the young guard stood watch, the boy, with a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, managed to catch his eye. He made a small, almost imperceptible gesture, and when the guard instinctively glanced down, the boy let the scrap of linen fall to the floor near his feet. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The guard's eyes widened in comprehension and terror. He hesitated, his body frozen in a conflict between duty and conscience. He could pretend he hadn't seen it. He could walk away and save himself. But in that frozen moment, he made a fatal choice. He bent down, scooped up the note, and concealed it within his tunic. The boy's heart soared with a hope so fierce it was painful. For the first time in months, he was not alone. Someone knew. Someone might help. That flicker of hope was extinguished with breathtaking speed and cold efficiency. The young guard, a man of simple honor, did not know the depths of the conspiracy he was up against. He took the note not to the council, but to his direct superior, a centurion he believed to be a man of integrity. The centurion read the note, his face grim. He praised the young guard for his loyalty and diligence, and promised to take the matter to the highest levels. The young guard left feeling proud, believing he had done the right thing, that he had saved his emperor. He was never seen again. Official records would later show he was transferred to a remote, disease-ridden outpost on the empire's deadliest frontier, a de facto death sentence. The response from the council was not the storm of fury the boy might have expected. It was something far worse, a cold, silent, and absolute tightening of the screw. There were no accusations, no interrogations. The day after the incident, the chief physician simply announced that the emperor had suffered a serious relapse. His agitation required a period of absolute quiet and minimal stimulation. The heavy curtains of his bedchamber were drawn, plunging the room into a perpetual twilight. The few remaining objects of comfort, a favorite blanket, a small carved animal he had kept from his childhood, were removed, deemed unhygienic, and his food rations were cut again, this time to a level that was barely sustainable for life. The thin broth became a watery gruel. The boiled root was reduced to a few pathetic slices. It was a punishment, but it was delivered as a prescription. It was a death sentence, but it was written as a cure. The message was brutally clear. Resistance was not only futile, it was counterproductive. Any attempt to fight back would only hasten his demise. Hope was not a lifeline. It was a poison that would make the end come quicker. The boy understood. The last spark of defiance in his soul died, leaving behind only the cold, gray ash of resignation. He was utterly, completely, and irrevocably alone, and his only remaining purpose was to wait for the end that his captors had so meticulously planned for him. The physical transformation of the boy emperor became a grotesque spectacle, a private horror show witnessed only by his captors. The human body, when subjected to prolonged starvation, begins to consume itself in a desperate, cannibalistic struggle for survival, and the narrator of this tragedy was the boy's own wasting flesh. First, the fat reserves, the body's stored energy, were burned away. The childish roundness of his cheeks and limbs disappeared, leaving behind a sharp, angular frame. His skin, once soft and supple, lost its elasticity, becoming dry and thin like parchment. Then the body turned to its muscles. The well-toned limbs of a boy who had once been taught horsemanship and swordsmanship began to atrophy. His arms and legs grew stick-thin, the joints at his knees and elbows becoming prominent, painful-looking knobs. He lost the strength to even sit up in bed, his head lolling against the pillows, too heavy for his atrophied neck muscles to support. The physicians, in their daily examinations, would document these changes with a chilling clinical detachment. Their journals, which survive as a testament to their complicity, speak of a marked reduction in superfluous tissue and a beneficial lightening of the corporeal frame. They were describing the systematic destruction of a childless body as if it were a successful medical procedure. They noted the appearance of lanugo, a fine downy hair that grew over his body, a desperate physiological attempt to insulate a frame that no longer had the fat to keep itself warm. He was constantly cold, even when piled with the heaviest furs, a deep internal chill that no external heat could touch. His hair became brittle and fell out in patches. His fingernails grew cracked and discolored. His teeth loosened in his gums. These were the classic textbook signs of severe malnutrition, signs that any competent physician would have recognized as an emergency. Yet, in the twisted reality of the imperial palace, these symptoms were presented as the inexorable progress of his unique and tragic wasting disease. The most horrifying aspect was the contrast between his decaying body and the imperial splendor that surrounded him. He would lie in his bed, a tiny skeletal figure, draped in robes of the richest purple silk, the heavy fabric seeming to mock the insubstantiality of the body beneath. His emaciated fingers, adorned with gold rings that now spun loosely around the bone, would lie limp upon covers embroidered with the emblem of his divine house. It was a living, breathing tableau of death in a lap of luxury, a macabre masterpiece of cruelty. His mind, too, began to suffer from the prolonged lack of nutrients. He experienced periods of profound confusion, unable to distinguish between dreams and reality. He would have vivid hallucinations, sometimes seeing his father's face hovering in the dim light, his expression one of sorrow and disappointment. At other times, he would slip into a state of deep apathy, staring at the ceiling for hours on end, his mind a blank slate, emptied of thought and feeling. This mental decline was, for the council, the final welcome stage. A boy who could no longer think, who could no longer feel, was a boy who could no longer suffer in a way that might trouble the consciences of the few servants who still possessed them. He was becoming what they had always wanted him to be, a beautiful, tragic object, a symbol of divine fragility. His humanity slowly, and systematically stripped away until nothing remained but the story they wished to tell. The question that echoes through the marble halls of this horrific story is, how? How could a child be slowly murdered in the heart of a bustling palace, surrounded by hundreds of servants, guards, nobles, and officials, and yet no one intervened? The answer is a chilling case study in the psychology of systemic complicity, a demonstration of how a culture of fear and ambition can neutralize the moral compass of an entire society. The conspiracy was not a secret kept by a handful of men in a locked room. It was an open secret, a truth that hung in the air like a foul miasma, acknowledged by everyone and spoken of by no one. For the vast majority of the palace staff, from the kitchen maids to the chamberlains, the motive for silence was simple and primal: fear. The council's purges had been swift and silent. The young guard who had tried to help, the old tutor who had shown too much affection, these were cautionary tales whispered among the staff. To speak out was not just to risk one's position. It was to risk one's life and the lives of one's family. Survival depended on a carefully cultivated blindness, an ability to see without seeing, to know without knowing. A servant might deliver the pathetic meal to the emperor's chambers, his heart aching with pity. But he would see the impassive faces of the council as guards at the door, and his pity would curdle into terror. He would bow his head, perform his task, and walk away, his silence the price of his own continued existence. For the nobility and the high-ranking officials, the motives were more complex, a toxic cocktail of ambition and denial. Many of them benefited directly from the council's rule. They were granted new titles, lucrative governorships, and profitable contracts. The new regime was a fountain of opportunity, and to challenge its foundational crime would be to turn off the tap. They chose to believe the official narrative because it was convenient and profitable to do so. The emperor was sick. The council was doing its best in a tragic situation. It was a comforting lie, one that allowed them to enjoy the fruits of a silent coup without having to acknowledge the blood that fertilized the orchard. They practiced a form of collective denial, a willful ignorance that insulated them from moral responsibility. They would attend council meetings where the emperor's failing health was discussed with grave concern, and they would nod along, participating in the fiction, each person's complicity reinforcing the others. It became a self-sustaining ecosystem of deceit, where questioning the lie was a greater social transgression than accepting the murder. The physicians and tutors were perhaps the most morally bankrupt of all, for they were not passive observers, but active participants. They cloaked their monstrous actions in the language of professionalism and duty. They were not starving a child. They were administering a therapeutic dietary regimen. They were not psychologically torturing him. They were calming an over-agitated spirit. This clinical jargon was their shield, a way to create a moral distance from the horror of their actions. They were cogs in a machine, following the orders of their superiors, their consciences anesthetized by the promise of wealth, status, and the simple, seductive comfort of being on the winning side. The entire palace, therefore, became a conspiracy of silence, a society where individual morality was sacrificed at the altar of collective security and personal gain. The boy emperor was not killed by a few evil men. He was killed by a system, a culture of complicity that they had expertly engineered. His slow death was the price of everyone else's comfort and ambition, a human sacrifice that allowed the machinery of power to continue turning smoothly and without interruption. The final days were a period of tense, silent waiting. The boy emperor had slipped into a state of near-permanent torpor, his life reduced to the faintest of breaths, the slowest of heartbeats. He was no longer a person. He was a process, a biological clock slowly winding down. The physician's daily visits became a mere formality, a ritual performed for the sake of the official record. They would feel for his thready pulse, listen to the shallow whisper of his lungs, and make a note in their journals. The divine spirit prepares for its journey. The atmosphere in the palace was thick with a strange, predatory stillness. The members of the council, their long and patient work now nearing its conclusion, were like vultures circling a dying animal. They no longer spoke of the boy's recovery. Instead, their secret meetings were consumed with the final arrangements, the meticulous planning of the post-mortem world. They argued over the wording of the official death announcement, ensuring it struck the perfect balance of profound sorrow and stoic reassurance. They finalized the details of the succession, a seamless transfer of power to the council itself, now to be legitimized by the last will and testament of the deceased emperor, a document he had, of course, never seen. They planned the funeral, a spectacle of imperial grief that would be the capstone of their magnificent lie. It would be the grandest funeral the empire had ever witnessed, a public performance designed to cement their image as the devoted, heartbroken guardians who had fought so desperately to save their beloved ruler. While the boy lay dying, they were designing the stage upon which they would mourn him. This period revealed the absolute coldness of their calculations. There was no trace of remorse, no flicker of doubt. Their concern was not for the child whose life was extinguishing a few rooms away, but for the smooth execution of their political theater. They were producers overseeing the final moments of a long and complex production, anxious that nothing should mar the premiere. The few remaining servants who tended to the boy did so in a state of terrified awe. They moved about the darkened chamber like ghosts, changing his linens, moistening his cracked lips with a damp cloth. They spoke only in whispers, as if any loud noise might finally sever the gossamer thread that still tethered him to life. They were witnesses to the final act, their silence bought with fear, their presence a part of the grim tableau. They would later be handsomely rewarded for their discretion, their silence a permanent condition of their continued prosperity. The boy himself was largely beyond suffering now. He drifted in a gray, timeless twilight, a liminal space between life and death. There were moments, witnesses reported, of brief, startling lucidity. His eyes would open and seem to focus for a second, a flicker of awareness in the cavernous sockets. In one such moment, a servant swore he saw a single tear trace a path through the grime on the boy's cheek. It was a final, silent protest, a drop of human sorrow in an ocean of calculated cruelty. But these moments were fleeting. Mostly he was still, a fragile sculpture of bone and skin, his only movement the slight, almost imperceptible rise and fall of the silk sheet over his chest. The council waited. The empire waited, though it did not know it. And in the opulent, silent heart of the palace, a child, stripped of everything but his famous name, quietly prepared to relinquish even that. The end did not come with a storm or a struggle, but with a quiet, pathetic whisper. On a cold, gray dawn, a servant, entering the chamber to begin the morning ritual, noticed a new and absolute stillness. The faint, fluttering rise and fall of the silk sheet over the emperor's chest had ceased. The boy was gone. The physician was summoned, and he performed his final solemn duty. He felt for a pulse that was no longer there, listened for a breath that would never come again. He closed the boy's eyes, which seemed to sink even deeper into the skull, and then he pulled the silk sheet over the child's face, formally concluding the life that his own actions had so methodically destroyed. He then turned to the council member waiting by the door and nodded, his expression a mask of professional gravity. The word spread through the palace not like a fire, but like a cold fog, seeping silently under doors and through stone corridors. The long wait was over. The pre-written script could now be performed. The council members, dressing in the robes of deepest mourning they had prepared weeks in advance, gathered to make the official announcement. Their leader, his voice breaking with expertly feigned emotion, declared to the assembled court that their divine emperor, after a long and heroic struggle against a cruel and mysterious illness, had finally been released from his suffering and ascended to the heavens. He spoke of the boy's courage, his wisdom beyond his years, his gentle spirit. He wept, and his performance was so convincing that many in the room, caught in the powerful current of collective emotion, wept with him. They were mourning the fictional boy the council had created, and in doing so, they became the final, unknowing accomplices to the murder of the real one. The tragic irony of the boy's death was profound. He was arguably the most powerful individual in the known world, a living god to millions, the master of a dozen legions, the owner of a treasury that could fund empires. His name could raise armies and topple cities. Yet he died of the most primitive and powerless of afflictions, simple, common hunger. He died of neglect, alone in a room filled with priceless artifacts, a forgotten child in the heart of a world that revolved around him. His death was the ultimate symbol of the hollowness of absolute power, a demonstration that the grandest titles and the most opulent surroundings are meaningless without a single caring human hand to offer a piece of bread. The council had achieved their perfect crime. It was a murder without a weapon, a coup without a battle. They had weaponized their duty of care, transforming medicine into poison and protection into a prison. They had killed their king with compassion, and the world would remember them as his most loyal and heartbroken servants. As the news spread throughout the city and the empire, a wave of genuine grief followed. The people mourned the loss of their beautiful, tragic boy ruler, the son of their great hero, taken from them too soon by the cruel whims of fate. They had no reason to doubt the story they were told. They had seen the idealized portraits, heard the tales of his wisdom, and now they participated in the manufactured sorrow, their grief the final seal on the council's masterpiece of deception. The boy emperor was dead, and the world mourned a saint, never knowing they should have been avenging a victim. The funeral was the council's crowning achievement, the final, audacious act in their theater of cruelty. It was a spectacle of grief so immense, so perfectly choreographed, that it silenced any lingering whispers of doubt and solidified the council S power as the legitimate and heartbroken heirs of a martyred saint. The city was draped in black. The great temple bells tolled continuously for 3 days, their mournful drone a constant citywide reminder of the nation's loss. The boy's body, now skillfully embalmed and dressed in the most magnificent imperial robes, was placed on public display. The embalmers had artfully used wax and cosmetics to fill out the hollows of his face, creating a serene, almost cherubic death mask that bore little resemblance to the skeletal visage of his final days. He looked like a beautiful child sleeping, not a victim of starvation. Thousands of citizens filed past the bier, weeping at the sight of their lost sovereign, their grief a testament to the power of the council's propaganda. The funeral procession itself was a masterpiece of political messaging. A golden catafalque, drawn by 6 white horses, carried the small coffin through the streets. The members of the council walked directly behind it, their heads bowed, their faces etched with a sorrow so profound it seemed to age them before the crowd's eyes. They were the image of devoted, grieving fathers who had lost their cherished son. It was a performance worthy of the grandest stage, and it was utterly convincing. The official eulogy, delivered by the council's leader, was a work of rhetorical genius. He spoke of a boy too pure for this world, a spirit so bright that it had consumed its own fragile vessel. He did not mention a sickness. Instead, he framed the death in mystical, divine terms. The emperor had not died. He had been recalled to the heavens, his earthly mission complete. By deifying the boy in death, he rendered any questions about the physical circumstances of his demise impious and irrelevant. One could not perform an autopsy on a god. This narrative was immediately and powerfully effective. To question the official story was now tantamount to heresy. The boy's death was transformed from a potential crime scene into a sacred event, a moment of national tragedy and spiritual significance. The council had not just avoided blame. They had wrapped themselves in the sacred mantle of the boy's memory, becoming the high priests of his posthumous cult. They were no longer just political leaders. They were the guardians of a martyr's legacy, and their authority was now imbued with a holy light. The ultimate hypocrisy was the monument they commissioned in his honor. A towering mausoleum of white marble was erected in the heart of the city, larger and more magnificent than even his father's tomb. It was adorned with reliefs depicting scenes from the boy's life, the fictional scenes they had invented. There he was, shown commanding troops, debating with philosophers, and benevolently receiving foreign ambassadors. At the center of the tomb, a statue showed him ascending to the heavens, guided by eagles. It was the final lie, carved in stone for eternity, a permanent monument to a life that had never been lived, built by the men who had stolen the real one. The council's victory, however, was as hollow and transient as the life of the boy they had destroyed. In eliminating the emperor, they had removed the single, unifying symbol that held the fractured, ambitious factions of the court together. The boy's presence, even as a weakened, silent figure, had provided a center of gravity, a legitimate authority to which all sides had to at least feign allegiance. With him gone, that center collapsed, and the dark political energies they had so carefully managed were unleashed in their full fury. The serpent of their conspiracy began to eat its own tail. The very men who had been united in their patient, meticulous plot to murder a child now found that they had nothing in common but a shared, unforgivable crime. The bonds of complicity, so strong when facing a common obstacle, proved brittle in the face of raw, naked ambition. The council, once a united front, splintered into warring factions, each leader seeing the others not as allies, but as rivals for the ultimate prize, the empty throne. The leader of the council, the architect of the whole affair, believed his cunning and foresight entitled him to supreme power. But his colleagues, having witnessed his capacity for ruthless, patient betrayal firsthand, trusted him no more than they would a venomous snake. They had all learned the art of the slow, deniable kill from a master, and now they prepared to practice it on each other. The civil war that followed was not a swift, glorious conflict of armies in the field. It was a palace war, a shadowy, brutal affair fought in corridors and council chambers, with poison, forged documents, and the assassin's blade. It was the logical continuation of the methods they had used against the boy, now turned inward. The empire, which had appeared so stable under their manufactured rule, was plunged into chaos. Provincial governors, seeing the weakness at the center, declared their independence. The legions on the frontiers, their loyalties divided, turned on one another. The treasury, plundered to fund the warring factions' private armies, ran dry. The carefully constructed facade of a strong united empire crumbled, revealing the rotten foundations beneath. There is a profound and terrible irony in their fate. The boy emperor's death, which they had orchestrated with such precision to ensure stability and secure their own power, became the direct cause of their ruin and the empire's near collapse. They had feared the instability of a child ruler, and in their efforts to prevent it, they had unleashed a far greater and more destructive instability. In a way, the murdered boy had his revenge from beyond the grave. His absence was a more powerful and disruptive force than his presence had ever been. He became a ghost that haunted their every victory, a symbol of the original sin that had poisoned their entire enterprise. Each of the council members met a violent and ignominious end. The chief architect was stabbed to death by his own guards, bought by a rival. The chief physician was found poisoned, his face frozen in a rictus of surprise. Others were executed after show trials, exiled, or simply disappeared. Within a few years, none of the men who had gathered around the boy's throne, the silent, smiling vultures, were left alive. They had successfully seized power, only to be consumed by it, their grand political masterpiece ending in a bloody, pathetic farce. Their story serves as a timeless warning that power obtained through the annihilation of innocence is cursed, built on a foundation of sand, destined to be washed away by the very tides of chaos it seeks to control. If we were to conduct a modern autopsy on this historical tragedy, we would diagnose the cause of death not as a wasting sickness, but as a meticulously executed, slow-motion coup d'etat. The council's actions were not those of concerned guardians, but of highly intelligent political assassins who understood that the most effective coups are not those won with swords, but those won with narratives. They didn't seize the throne. They emptied it, creating a vacuum that only they could fill. Their primary weapon was psychological warfare, deployed with a sophistication that is chillingly familiar to the modern student of totalitarianism. The systematic isolation of the victim, the control of all information, the use of propaganda to create an alternate reality, and the deployment of gaslighting to make the victim doubt their own sanity. These are the classic hallmarks of an abusive, authoritarian regime. The boy emperor was the first citizen of a state that had been captured by its own bureaucracy. The palace became a microcosm of a totalitarian society, where truth is dictated from above, and dissent is pathologized as illness or madness. The complicity of the court illustrates what modern psychology calls the diffusion of responsibility. When a crime is committed by a system, no single individual feels the full weight of moral culpability. The guard was just following orders. The physician was providing medical care. The noble was acting in the best interests of the state. Each person's role was small, their contribution to the final horror seemingly minor. Yet, when combined, These small acts of cowardice and self-interest created an unstoppable engine of destruction. It is a powerful reminder that the greatest evils in history are rarely the product of a single monstrous villain, but are more often the result of ordinary people choosing to look away. We can also analyze the council members themselves through the lens of psychopathy, particularly the trait of low affective empathy combined with high cognitive empathy. They were intellectually capable of understanding the boy's suffering indeed. They had to be, in order to fine-tune their torture for maximum effect. However, they felt no emotional connection to that suffering. The boy's pain was simply data, a variable to be managed in their political calculations. He was not a child. He was a problem to be solved, and they approached his destruction with the same cold, dispassionate logic they might apply to a complex logistical or financial issue. Their success in maintaining the lie for so long speaks to the power of what we now call information dominance. In an era without a free press or independent communication, they controlled every word, every image that emerged from the palace. They were the sole authors of reality, and they crafted a story so compelling and internally consistent that it became impregnable. The lesson is a sobering one. When a single entity has a monopoly on information, it has a monopoly on truth itself. The boy's story is not just a tale of ancient cruelty. It is a parable for the modern age, a warning about the dark potential that lies dormant within the structures of power, waiting for the right combination of ambition, fear, and a vulnerable target to be unleashed. In the end, the story of the 12-year-old emperor is not simply a historical account of a forgotten tragedy. It is a timeless allegory, a ghost story that haunts the very idea of power. His small, emaciated form casts a long shadow across the centuries, a permanent and unsettling reminder of the profound vulnerability of innocence in a world governed by ambition. He is a symbol of the ultimate betrayal. The betrayal of a child by his guardians, the betrayal of a nation by its leaders, the betrayal of the future by the present. His tale forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that the structures we build to create order and security can themselves become the most sophisticated instruments of cruelty. The palace was not just his home. It was the weapon that killed him. The rituals of state were not just ceremony. They were the chains that bound him. The language of care was not just for comfort. It was the narrative that disguised his murder. The boyish experience demonstrates that the most terrifying prisons are not those with iron bars and stone walls, but those with soft beds and gilded ceilings, prisons where the jailers smile and call you Lord. His legacy is one of profound and disturbing irony. The council, in their quest for absolute control, ultimately created absolute chaos. In their attempt to erase a boy, they inadvertently immortalized him, transforming him from a minor historical footnote into a powerful symbol of martyrdom. His story survived their propaganda, passed down in whispers and secret texts, a testament to the fact that truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of clawing itself back into the light. He is the ghost on the throne, a silent rebuke to all who believe that power is an end in itself. He represents the human cost of political calculation, the small, fragile body broken on the gears of the great machine of state. When we look at the grand portraits of emperors and kings, at the towering monuments they built to their own glory, his story compels us to look closer, to see the shadows behind the throne, to listen for the whispers in the silent halls. It reminds us that for every celebrated victory, for every year of supposed peace and stability, there is often a hidden price, a forgotten victim whose suffering paid for the comfort of the powerful. The boy emperor, whose name was erased by his tormentors, has become nameless in a different way. He has become archetypal. He is every child sacrificed for the ambitions of adults, every innocent soul consumed by the cynical machinations of power. His silent, starving presence is a permanent question posed to history. What is the purpose of an empire if it cannot protect its own child? It is a question that has no easy answer, and its echo is the true and lasting legacy of the boy who was starved to death in a room filled with gold.